Marriage has always been a site of power and privilege for some and exclusion and oppression for others throughout United States history. From an era of only letting white cis men have the benefits of marriage, the 2015 Obergefell v. Hodges Supreme Court case sparked positive change in U.S. culture and brought forward a new era of marriage equality in the form of legally mandating all U.S. states to license and recognize same-sex marriages through the 14th Amendment. However, true marriage equality still does not exist in the U.S. This is because of quote-unquote marriage penalties when disabled people enter a marriage. These penalties make it exponentially harder for people to keep their benefits from programs such as Social Security, insurance, SSI, Medicare, etc. Welcome to R+M Disability, where we discuss how understanding disability culture can and will change your perspective on life. In this third and final episode, let's talk about marriage inequality as it relates to disabled individuals tying the knot. This will involve discussing the history of marriage in U.S. history and its impact on minority groups such as women, enslaved peoples, and LGBTQ couples, and then examining disabled people's marriages and how barriers have influenced their lived experiences. And finally, considering what's next in terms of legislation and activism. Chapter 1, Marriage in U.S. History. Throughout American history, marriage has served multiple state interests and has evolved to reflect social and legal changes. The concept of marriage has always been used as political and financial tools for the majority of U.S. history. According to Shaw et al., marriage laws were, quote, derived from biological imperatives and were grounded exclusively in a state interest in procreation that led the American colonies and early states to enact marriage laws. By authorizing and regulating marriage, states have pursued political, economic, social, and legal interests. Those interests have been included complementing the state's governance of the population, including creating stable households, fostering social order, increasing economic benefit to individuals, and facilitating property transmission, end quote. As mentioned previously, marriage has been mainly reserved for and given power to white cis men in U.S. history. Minority groups such as women, the Black community, LGBTQ communities, and sadly even children have been abused and discriminated against when it comes to marriage. As disabled identity is inherently intersectional, the ways that marriage affected these communities also has a big part to play into how marriage equality was formed for those with disabilities. Women in marriage. It is no secret that women have always gotten the short end of stick in marriage deals, something that is still affecting women to this day. It is said in a timeline of legal history of women in the United States by the National Women's History Alliance, or the NWHA, that in 1769, quote, by marriage, the husband and wife are one person in the law. The very being and legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, end quote. This goes into coverture, a legal doctrine rooted from and based off of English law. The idea/concept of coverture is an especially important term to understand when analyzing the rights of women in marriage, as it, quote, held that no female person had a legal identity. At birth, a female baby was covered by her father's identity, and then, when she married, by her husband's. Because they did not legally exist, married women could not make contracts or be sued, so they could not own or work in businesses. Married women owned nothing. They had no rights to their children, so that if a wife divorced or left a husband, she would not see her children again, end quote. The fight for women's rights both in and outside of marriage took a long time and made slow progress. In 1839, Mississippi became the first state to allow women to hold property in their own name, but with their husband's permission. By 1869, the first women's suffrage law in the U.S. passed in Wyoming, and in 1872, Susan B. Anthony voted and was arrested and given a $100 fine, which is $2,660 today, for doing so. Wyoming was really woke, I guess, because in 1890, they granted women the right to vote in all elections. By 1920, the 19th Amendment was ratified, which allowed women to vote en masse, but there were still limitations for Black voters. Marriage in Black communities.
Under the laws of slavery, enslaved people were considered property rather than human beings with legal rights. As such, they were denied the legal recognition of marriage. Slave codes across the southern states explicitly forbade slaves from entering into legally binding marriages. This prohibition was rooted in the economic interest of slaveholders, who viewed the enslaved population primarily through the lens of labor and property. Allowing legal marriages would confer a form of human dignity and autonomy that directly contradicted the foundational principles of slavery. Moreover, slaveholders frequently disrupted enslaved families by selling off individual members to different owners with no regret for familial bonds. The constant threat of separation loomed over slave marriages, making any form of long-term family stability extremely precarious. Enslaved people had no legal recourse to prevent such separations or to reunite with family members. Despite these formidable obstacles, marriage among enslaved people emerged as a crucial institution with deep emotional and social significance.
As stated in the video, marriage in Black communities was commonly controlled and interrupted by enslavers. However, while there was lack of access and autonomy in legal marriages for enslaved people, they still found ways to celebrate their love through celebrations, ceremonies, and rituals such as jumping the broom. Additional barriers to entry within Black communities marrying was the Racial Integrity Act of 1924, which was passed in Virginia to prohibit interracial marriage and encourage the idea of eugenics in the United States. For those who aren't aware, eugenics is the idea of genetic superiority lying in certain genes, racial identities, able-bodiedness, etc., and has historically been used to control reproduction in minority groups. The 1924 Act targeted mass segments of people, and the Act and the idea of eugenics it encouraged will tie heavily into our discussion on disabled marriage and the inequality they face. Not only did this affect Black communities, but also tribal and Native communities, as Snook notes that, quote, as the head of Virginia's Bureau of Vital Statistics from 1912 to 1946, Plucker was responsible for ensuring that all infants born in Virginia received birth certificates that included their racial designation. An active eugenicist, Plucker used bureaucracy as a weapon against Black and Indigenous people across the state of Virginia, end quote. LGBTQ marriage and relationships. The inequality against queer individuals in the community can, like most inequality in the U.S., be traced back to colonialism and persecution against Native communities. The following clips from PBS's Origin of Everything paints the picture on how colonialism in the U.S. set up the foundation for marriage inequality within queer communities by criminalizing homosexuality.
In Queer Injustice, the criminalization of LGBT people in the United States, the editors Joey L. Mogul, Andrea J. Ritchie, and Kay Whitlock recount some of those early colonial accounts of queer life and the violence that was meted out to people who did not conform. They open their text with what is believed to be the first recorded instance of Spanish punishment for homosexuality in North America. In 1513, Conquistador Vasco Núñez de Balboa sentenced 40 men in current-day Panama to be thrown to as hunting dogs and dismembered because he claimed to witness them dressed as women and engaging in sex with other men. They go on to detail how early Christian historians and conquerors to Central America, South America, and the Caribbean detailed numerous instances of gay sex and people dressing in gender-fluid clothing as a way to rationalize what they did: penalize, persecute, and often kill Native Americans. Similarly, charges of sexual impropriety were often also lodged against recently enslaved Africans to justify brutal treatment and abuse. Although this initial example is one that is particularly brutal, it also reflects a longer and larger history of anti-gay laws in the Americas and the later established United States.
Since colonization, the criminalization of homosexuality continued within sodomy laws. In states such as Connecticut, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, Delaware, and New Jersey, pre-American Revolution, sodomy was a criminal offense punishable by prison, death, or castration. Pennsylvania had a specific history with criminalizing sodomy, as seen in their 1700 An Act Against Incest, Sodomy, and Bestiality, which, according to the Death Penalty Information Center, quote, required a man convicted of sodomy or bestiality to be imprisoned and whipped at a magistrate's discretion, and castrated if the man was married. At this time, this act was only applicable to white men. Black men who committed these same crimes against white women would be punished with a sentence of death, end quote. Post-American Revolution, many states changed their laws on sodomy in favor of a, quote, more humane legal system, end quote. Though punishments for sodomy in New Jersey still included fines, solitary confinement, and or hard labor. And while it wasn't until 1873 that South Carolina repealed the death penalty as punishment. Super shockingly, this still didn't address the main problem, which was inequality within homosexual relationships and options for marriage. In the 1950s, quote-unquote witch hunts of homosexual men ensued, and hate-based rhetoric equated consensual homosexual sex with child molestation, which is something we see today. It wasn't until 2003's Lawrence v. Texas Supreme Court case that sodomy laws across the U.S. were completely cleared. The landmark 2015 Obergefell v. Hodges Supreme Court case allowed same-sex couples to get married. This decision ushered forward a new era of marriage, but only addressed one form of marriage inequality in the U.S.
Chapter 2. Disabled Marriage and Eugenics. As mentioned earlier, the 1924 Racial Integrity Act utilized eugenics to be able to control the population and who people chose to marry and procreate with. Advocates of eugenics believe that methods like selective breeding and sterilization would benefit human society by promoting beneficial traits and discouraging other traits like disability, race, etc. However, this wasn't the first instance of eugenics and sterilization being a common idea in practice. In 1896, the first law made it illegal for disabled people to have sex or marry, with a punishment of facing 3 years in prison. Multiple other states soon followed and passed their own similar laws, and these expanded into laws for forced sterilization. In 1907, the first state law was passed that allowed doctors and institutions to perform forced sterilization. By the 1970s, over 60,000 people, both inside and outside of institutions, had been forcibly sterilized under 33 state laws. In the same year as the Racial Integrity Act, Virginia passed. The Virginia Sterilization Act, though it wasn't formally implemented until 1927, with the Buck v. Bell Supreme Court case in which they ruled that sterilization was constitutional. The first legal case of sterilization in Virginia was performed on Carrie Buck in October of 1927 at the Lynchburg Colony for epileptics and feeble-minded. Side note, feeble-minded in the scenario is a term used to describe someone with an intellectual disability. Buck had become pregnant in 1923 due to her being raped by a nephew of the foster family she had been staying with. Her foster family, quote, believing that the pregnancy was evidence and promiscuity and thus of feeble-mindedness, end quote, the foster family sought to have her committed, like her mother, to the Virginia State Colony. According to the National Women's Law Center, there are still 30 states that legally allowed forced sterilization, and with states still continuing to pass laws as recent as 2019 in Iowa and Nevada. Anathy recognizes the inherent ableism within these laws by saying, quote, forced sterilization laws are not an aberration, and a part of a larger, horrifying system that prevents disabled people from making basic decisions about their lives, their families, and their futures. These laws are part of a long history of state-sanctioned sterilizations and rooted in false paternalistic assumptions about disabled people. No judge, guardian, or politician should have the right to take away anyone's fundamental right to decide whether to have children. It's long overdue to fully transform this ruthless system, end quote. By acknowledging the role eugenics has played in U.S. history, it is easier to understand how it is still possible for disabled people to face marriage and inequality today. The idea of marriage inequality when it comes to disabled individuals stems from the marriage penalties within Social Security SSI income. According to the Disability Rights and Education and Defense Fund, DREDF, quote, whether an individual is eligible for SSI and the amount of their monthly stipend depends on their income and assets. People with more income receive less in cash benefits, and having a certain amount in income or assets makes you completely ineligible for SSI. In 2026, the federal maximum monthly stipend for SSI is $994 for an individual and $1,491 for a married couple. Therefore, to be eligible for an SSI, an individual's countable monthly income cannot exceed $994, and a marriage couple's combined countable monthly income cannot exceed $1,491. An individual also cannot have over $2,000 in assets, and a married couple cannot have over $3,000 in assets. These asset limits have not changed in over 35 years, end quote. When two SSI recipients marry, monthly stipend, maximum countable income, and maximum countable assets are 25% less than if they had remained unmarried. In the following clip, disability justice advocate Lucia Andre Duquette talks about the unfairness in these rules, as well as what they say about our idea of care.
Remember that these rules were made back in the 50s and 60s, and I think updated in the 90s. So you really antiquated ideas of care, how we give care, who is deserving of care, and what is the role and responsibilities of a partner or a spouse. The partner's income being accounted for, I think, goes back to the ways in we think about disability and care, that it is on the spouse to be able to do this. It's also that kind of thing that I think just ingrained in our society about coupledom and what should be the obligations of a partner and spouse. And so that they should be taking care of you rather than community care being a standard and practice that we have in this country. Societal says that, if you don't have that piece of paper, it's not a legitimate relationship. You're not serious about the person that you are with. Look at these arbitrary thresholds that are created from SSI to Medicaid to all of these different services and saying, why is that even there? And how do we make the policy to be more inclusive, regardless of your relationship status, to be able to say, should we be co-signing people into poverty? Is this actually working to get the people the care that they need? I think a universal health care system would also be beneficial, not like this Medicare for all, because that's actually not inclusive of disabled people, but a true universal healthcare system that wouldn't be tied to marriage or employment would be very freeing for disabled people.
Groups of individuals got together and said, because of your human condition, we don't think you should have the right to marry, the right to do this. Your income limits can only be this. And because you're a burden on society, we'll give you enough that you ain't dead, but not enough to live.
Chapter 3, Lived Experiences. To truly understand the challenges, heartbreak, and overall struggle within marriage and equality for those with disabilities, we have to listen to their stories and experiences. The next few minutes of clips detail first-hand accounts of how disabled people navigate marriage and connection with their partners.
My fiance at the time and I were looking to get married. We had set a date, but behind the scenes was, how was I going to pull this off? Because if I get married, then I lose my personal care, the ability to get my wheelchair fixed, my health care. If we go and I say we're married with state recognition, the economic disaster would be crazy. It was a tug of war because we wanted this in front of the eyes of God and family.
Chapter 4. What's next? While marriage inequality isn't necessarily a current event and has been intertwined with U.S. history for decades, currently there are moves to help to change the system which allows this inequality to happen. For example, Congressman David Villado joined Rep. Susie Lee to reintroduce the Eliminating the Marriage Penalty and SSI Act, a bipartisan bill which excludes a spouse's income and resources when determining eligibility for supplemental security income and disregards marital status when calculating the SSI benefit amount as stated by the Congress website. While this was introduced a year ago, we can still see that progress is being made and disabled people are fighting for equality. Disabled people have been fighting to be able to have equality with relationships and marriage for decades. By supporting bills such as the EMPSA and calling on our local representatives to prioritize disabled people's needs, we can create a better future for our current disabled community, as well as for future generations. There is no equality or justice for anybody until that is the case for everybody.
This was R+M Disability. Peace out.
Peace out.
Yo.
Yo. No more episodes ever.
Yay!